Today we'll be in John 6, and we're going to take our reading beginning in verse 16. This is John's short account of Jesus walking on the water. It's interesting, compared to the other two places where this is recorded, how sparse of an account John gives. So much more detail, so much more liveliness to the accounts in Matthew and Mark. But John obviously knows those are there. John, by general consensus, John wrote after the other Gospels, knowing what was in those accounts, and he covers material that's otherwise not there. It is interesting, this is one of the few accounts that's in three Gospels. Now, there are a number of miracles recorded in three Gospels, but all the other three Gospel miracles it's Matthew, it's Mark, and Luke. The Synoptics have the same miracles recorded. There's only one miracle that all four record. So John only records one miracle that the other Gospels had already previously covered and published, and that is the feeding of the 5,000, aside from the resurrection itself. So the only ministry miracle of Jesus that's in all four Gospels is the feeding of the 5,000. So John, having known the others covered that, he must have thought it's really important I cover that too. And then he covers, again with this kind of sparse account, the walking on the water, even though Matthew and Mark had already covered it. So there's something that must be very important here that John has us, takes our mind to. And I really think it is helping us to set the mind and understand the mindset of the apostles. The apostles are about to undergo a great test of faith, as will everybody who follows Jesus in the latter part of John 6 in the bread of life discourse. Because in the bread of life discourse, Jesus almost makes it really hard. It seems like almost to the point of impossibility of really following him. He makes it hard to follow him. And we're going to have to deal with that and know why. And what is the response of the apostles? What's the response of the people? And then we'll have to ask and test our own hearts. What is our opinion about this? And so here on this next little step in the guided tour to belief that we've made of our study of John, we found in John 6:14, and I know it's been a while since we studied John because of sickness and travel and various things that have come up. But if you would recall, the last time we were in John in verse 14, the great crowds, after Jesus had fed those 5,000, they saw the sign he performed, and they said, "This is truly the prophet who's come into the world." But as we know from what's coming up in John 6, this is not where Jesus went and took a victory lap. He didn't do a celebrity lecture tour around Judea and Galilee with all these who are acknowledging him. Instead, he makes it hard for a lot of them to continue to follow. And the reason for that is in verse 15. So Jesus, perceiving that they were intended to come and take him by force and make him king, withdrew again to the mountain by himself alone. And so, as the ministry of Jesus had begun with Jesus alone out in the wilderness, now Jesus goes alone into the wilderness again, and he leaves his ill-informed followers behind. We'll make this point again next week, but I like it so much, we'll go ahead and preview it, that it's amazing and scary how similar the desires of Satan and the desires of ill-informed disciples are. Have Jesus be the king of this world. Satan offered to give Jesus that. And the disciples here, these misinformed disciples, are not just offering to make Jesus that. They appear to be putting plans in motion to do the very thing. And so Jesus now, in this incident of the night, walking on the water, will appear to his disciples with an absolute amount of reassurance in a set of private yet powerful miracles. in a place where Jesus is being watched by thousands every day to see where he's going, where it seems like there's never not an eye on Jesus, he's somehow going to work these amazing miracles, multiple ones of them, that show his disciples, his true disciples, his apostles, show them his real divinity while leaving everybody else totally in the dark. And when the things become hard in the rest of this chapter, and many will decide, well, I don't think we can follow this guy. I don't like the sound of that whatsoever that he's saying. These apostles will, having just had this another reassurance, as though the feeding of the 5,000 weren't enough, but it wasn't enough for many. They got fed and still left him. The apostles will know to stay with him. And so this incident of walking on the water is going to be a most frightening and, at the end, most reassuring of nights. Amazing night here following the feeding of the 5,000. Again, we'll read, and compared to the other Gospels, we'll notice just kind of the sparseness of John's account. So John 6:16 beginning. Now when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea. And after getting into a boat, they started to cross the sea to Capernaum. And it had already become dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. And the sea began to be stirred up because of a strong wind that was blowing. And then, when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea. And drawing near to the boat, they were frightened. And he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." So they were willing to receive him into the boat. I guess so. And immediately, the boat was at the land to which they were going. And so again, we're familiar with this from Matthew 14 and Mark 6. And we just think about all the things Jesus didn't talk about, or John didn't talk about, that are here. All that conversation about Peter and Peter walking on the water and Peter sinking and the like. And them thinking he was a ghost and all of that. And so what we find is Jesus went off to be alone. He put the apostles in a boat. He said, "Y'all go home, and I am going to the mountain." It says if we read from Mark that he took them to the boat and he dismissed the crowd. He told them to go home, the apostles to go home in their boat, and he went off to the mountain. And so they did. They went home as Jesus said. And we think about the apostles and the importance over and over of their obedience. That they believe in Jesus, so they do what he says. Now sometimes I think that was joyful and productive work. And they could easily see the benefit of it the day before. Some of his instructions, for instance, have the groups sit down by 50s. And they did. They had them do that. And then he said, take them this food. And they took the food. And when it was all done and everybody had eaten their fill, he said, collect up the baskets of the leftovers. And so they did. And sometimes they're able to do in the sight of Jesus and at Jesus' instruction, they're able to do joyful and productive work. It may have been tiring. And somebody might have said, I'd rather be sitting with one of the 50s than doing all this work. Everybody shouldn't eat the same. But no, I don't think they bickered at that. I don't think these men are afraid of hard work. And even though the work might be tiresome, and even though the work may be difficult, if we find it productive and we're able to do good things, who objects? Isn't that some of our best days? Wearing ourselves out doing joyful, productive work. And so they obeyed Jesus, and it went well. But now, this obedience, I don't think went as expected. They are told to get in the boat and go home without him. Well, I don't think I want to do that, right? I don't want to leave you. No, go home. And then that boat trip turned out to be a lot longer and a lot tougher than they expected. as it says in verse 18, the sea began to be stirred up, and a strong wind was blowing, right? And so we think about that old the favorite hymn of my childhood. You know, the weather started getting rough, the tiny ship was tossed. If not for the sorry, that wasn't the hymn. But, you know, without the courage of the crew in the storm and the difficulty there, but the wind is blowing, and these guys cover only 3 or 4 miles. It's actually given in stadia in the original 25 or 30 stadia. A stadia was, well, originally the length of a stadium. It's about 1/8 of a mile. John says they only went 25 or 30 stadia, so they only got 3 or 4 miles. And it was already now, not just in the middle of the night, but past the middle of the night. In Mark 14, the boat had gone a long distance from the land, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. It was the 4th watch of the night. Now, Jesus had told them to go home there when the day was nearly over at the feeding of the 5,000, and they left as nightfall was coming. And now it is the 4th watch, and that began at 3. And that's over at 6. That's in the morning. And so through the entire evening and through the middle of the dark, small number hours, till sometime after 3, so 3 or 4 or 5 in the morning, while it's still yet very dark in the 4th watch, they were still out there on the sea. And they'd only got 3 or 4 miles. In 7, 8, 9, something like that, in 7, 8, 9 hours, they'd only gone 3 or 4 miles. The wind was against them, wasn't it? And so we think about these men, professionals at moving boats, professionals at this sea, men who had experience there. Here they are fighting this wind for the entirety of the evening into past the wee hours of the morning, making something like a half mile an hour of progress. So this boat trip, the one without Jesus, it didn't seem like it was going all that well. And that's how it can seem in life, that we're in the boat and we're rowing for all we're worth, and we are making no headway. Now, I sometimes realize I'm making no headway in life when I'm in the troubles of my own sin. When the things I have done come back to haunt me. When the consequences of my action spring back. I'm not surprised at all to find myself in the cold, in the dark, to be lost and alone, to be dispirited, to be upset, to be of short temper. As a matter of fact, the more I know my sin caused this, sometimes the worse about those things I get. No, I'm not surprised at the lack of progress in my life when it comes and has come by disobedience or carelessness. But these guys are out there all night rowing and straining in a boat, making no progress without Jesus, because they were doing what he said to do. You know, sometimes that's when it gets really hard to find myself at peace in those situations, to find myself continuing to struggle and strain at the oar when I know I should and I know I was told to. But it just seems like this should be going better, right? Why does this happen to me? Don't I deserve better? Shouldn't it go better for me if I followed his instructions? And sometimes that's when real bitterness and resentment set in. I can see it when I caused it. But when I didn't do anything to cause it, why is this being so difficult? I did what he said. And that's when some people say, well, I need a different boat. Well, good luck with that when you get to shore. Maybe we can try it. But right now you're in the boat you're in. Or maybe we should just go to a different place. You know, if we went back the other way with the wind behind us, how fast would we get there? Right? We would get back in a hurry. 3 or 4 miles, we'd cover that in 30 minutes or so. Or maybe I need to be in a boat with different people. But, you know, the disciples here in a storm, in a boat, in the middle of the lake, in the middle of the night, they were in the place where God would show them an unforgettable display of Jesus' divine nature and power and caring in just a little bit longer. And so sometimes we don't know why our boat stalled out where it stalled out. Maybe it stalled out there to be a help to somebody else. Maybe it stalled out there as an exercise for us to learn patience, to, as James said, find joy and find spiritual progress in trials, in temptations. We don't know why our boat's in bad a shape as it often appears to be when it sure looks like we were trying to follow the instructions. But as the old hymn says, and this one actually is an old hymn, God moves in a mysterious way. His wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. I almost can't help but wonder if this is maybe not a passage that hymn refers to. And so it is now at this time and place that they see the frightening power of Jesus. They thought it was a ghost in Matthew's gospel. In John here in verse 19 it says, Jesus walked on the sea drawing near, and they were frightened. I think I would have been frightened long before these guys. Being out there in a boat all night and that kind of wind and waves. But that they were used to. What they weren't used to was somebody walking up on them when they were doing it. What they weren't used to was somebody coming out of the mist. Somebody coming along the waves. And he just comes walking by. In Mark's gospel it says this. And it has a turn of phrase that often we wonder, what does that mean? What is the significance of that? When it was evening, it says, Mark 6:47, when it was evening and the boat was in the midst of the sea, he was alone on the land, and seeing them straining at the oars. So that I mentioned straining. He saw them long before they saw him. Remember that. He knows our situation before we know his. He knows more about us than we know of him. But seeing them straining at the oar, for the wind was against them, and about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea, and he intended to pass them by. And for a long time, I was like, what does that mean? Was he just going to walk right past them? And I've seen commentaries that mention he was just going to walk right by them. What? They weren't going to. They were just going to go, oh, hey, I think that's Jesus. I don't think that's what walking on the sea and intending to pass them by means, because we have some language of the Old Testament that I think this is a direct reference to that we may not see. It says in Job 9, talking about what God does, talking about the attributes of God. Job 9:8, he alone stretches out the heavens and tramples down the waves of the sea. In the King James it says he treads on the depths of the sea. In the Septuagint, it said there in Job 9 and verse 8, he walks upon the sea as a floor. And this was the translation they would have been most familiar with, the apostles in the Greek Old Testament. It is an attribute of God that he treads on or walks on the sea. What's Jesus doing? Well, in Mark's gospel, he's walking on the sea. And then it says, he's intending to pass them by. If we go back to Job, in the same context, not the same verse, but 2 verses down, still talking about God, the one who made the constellations, the Bear, Orion, and Pleiades, and the chambers of the south, who does great things, the unfathomable, and wondrous works without number. It says, were he to pass me by, I would not see him. Were he to move past me, I would not perceive him. So Job is saying, God could be doing things that I would have no clue. He could be right on top of me. He could be right beside me. He could walk right by me and I wouldn't know. Again, from the Septuagint, if he would pass over me, I would not notice. If he would pass by me, likewise I wouldn't perceive it. And so in Job, we have the tying it together of walking on the water and passing by. But that passing by is also a very special way that God has described both in Exodus 33 and in 1 Kings 19. And if you are really good at know your Bible, you know both of these texts are about God's prophets on the mountain seeing the glory of God. In Exodus 19, it's Moses. In Exodus 33, Exodus 33, it's Moses. In 1 Kings 19, it's Elijah. And they're both on the mountain. And what is God going to do? He is going to have His glory shown to them while He is passing by. It'll come about, this is Exodus 33, while my glory is passing by, I will put you in the cleft of the rock and cover you with my hand until I pass by. And in 1 Kings 19, go forth and stand on the mountain of the Lord, for behold, the Lord is passing by. And then Elijah saw and heard the great wind, the earthquake, and the fire, and the gentle wind. And God wasn't in any of those things, was He? But eventually God spoke to him and came to him in His word. At that time He said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" But all of those appearances, those were as God was passing by. I think this passing by here in Mark, Jesus treading on the water, walking on the water like it's a floor, I think this is a demonstration of His glory, just like God on the mountain. And we think about the apostles now, on a boat, in a storm, in the middle of the night. The day before, there were literal thousands of people surrounding them and watching their every move. And they watched Jesus leave, and they watched the disciples get in the boat. And how does the next story start? They were watching for His boat and where He was at. And so every day there are thousands of eyes on Jesus. But who saw His glory? Only the apostles, on a boat, in the dark, in the middle of the night. And so you think, how is it that God could display His glory? How could Jesus display His divinity? How is it we could have a recreation of a great event with Moses and Elijah with Jesus for only the apostles and not for all the prying eyes of the world to see? Oh, it happened in that quiet place. It happened in that place where nobody else was, in the night between the times when thousands of eyes were on Jesus all day long. And so we wonder, what could God do? Out of what small things? Out of what can God make the most amazing things occur? He can do it with a few guys in a boat, in a storm, in the middle of the night. And so then Jesus comes, and what does Jesus do? And this is after the Peter walking on the water business. Jesus, as He gets in the boat, He says in verse 20 to them, He says, "It is I, do not be afraid." And so of all the great things of God's power, of all the great things that God does, what is it that is to bring them confidence and assurance? It's His words. Right? You think about all that God does, all the things that God's commanded, all of His power, all the ways to make His honor and His glory known. And what's the primary one? What He says to us by way of reassurance and instruction. Like we studied last week from the Psalms. Psalm 130 and verse 5. I wait for the Lord. My soul does wait. In His word I do hope. In His word. And so we are like that. We hope in His word. When Jesus was leaving the apostles for the last time, what is it that He said, I'm leaving you with? What is it that is going to stay with you? We'll skip forward to John 14 and verse 23. If anyone loves me, he'll keep my word. And my Father will love him. And we will come to him and make our abode with him. He who does not love me does not keep my word. And the word which you hear is not mine, but the Father who sent me. These things I've spoken to you while abiding with you. So I've been here and I've been telling you what? Keep my word. This is how you show me love. This is how the Father expresses his love to you. And as I'm gone, verse 26, there'll come a helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name. He will teach you and bring to remembrance what? My words. Or as it says, all the things I've said to you. So, peace I leave you. My peace I give you. Not as the world gives, do I give to you. But let not your heart be troubled. And again, the same word is here. Let it not be fearful. So here's my comfort. It's my solid word. The great comfort, the great reassurance for them, expressed in this power of Jesus to have the attributes of God, to walk on the sea, to calm the storm, because as soon as he got in the boat, the other Gospels tell us the wind ceased. It's demonstrated in that great power, but the message is what? The message is in words. The message is, it's me, don't be afraid. And so when we're in our little boat, going against the wind, what's the message we need to have with us and in our hearts? Whose words do we need to remember? And whose words and whose commandments do we need to live by? And so the apostles are given this utter reassurance just for them. Not for those great crowds that Jesus is going to run half of them off or better anyway the next day or two. But for them who truly believe. He gives them this ultimate assurance. It's me, so you don't have to be afraid. And then he shows his power all the more. We also have on the chart, though, I guess we could mention briefly the ending of the Great Commission. After you teach them all things that I command you, lo, I am with you, even to the end of the age. Yeah, he's with us. He shows them one last demonstration of power. Here at the end of the night, just before dawn, he'd sent them home in the storm, and by their own strenuous efforts, they'd only got halfway. But John tells us that the other Gospels don't. But John adds just one more miraculous detail. Verse 21, so they were willing to receive me into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. We have a miracle of teleportation. The other 4 or 5 miles from the middle of the sea to the place they were going. Matthew tells us that they worshiped him. I guess so. Mark, though, gives us, in the end of his account of this, a bit of a sad note of forewarning. He said they really hadn't grasped yet what these miracles meant. I wonder if that's true of us yet. But even though they didn't understand it all, they worshiped Jesus, and they were now safely home. And so that night they had been fearful. They hadn't been understanding. Surely they were wet, and they were tired, and they were amazed. But with Jesus in the end, they were home. Imagine them trying to explain this to their friends. John, years later, doesn't even bother to explain. He just said it happened. Hey, how'd you get here? You wouldn't believe me if I told you. And some of us, people ask us our journey of faith and the life we've led in Jesus Christ and how it led to the time and place where we're at and the fellowship with people we have and the connections we've seen and the blessings we've received. And we go, how did that happen? People say to us, I don't. It did. It just did. It worked out. And so they were home after this hard trip. And surely they were more reassured than ever about Jesus. And I don't know yet if they could make sense of it, and I don't think they could at that point very much make sense of it. But when the bread of heaven discourse happens, and Jesus quite literally runs off thousands of followers, what do these guys say? When Jesus asked them at the end, I know, spoilers for the next sections of the book, but Jesus will ask them, you guys want to leave too? And after all this, what do they say? Where would we go? you have the words of eternal life. And so, we find in this little sparse description of this amazing night of miracles, Jesus walking on the sea and going to pass by, showing his glory, showing his divinity, as God himself did to Moses and Elijah. Jesus is now shown not on the mountain, but down at the sea. He has shown who he is, and he has given them the words that they need. And we know they then stay close to Jesus. And that's what we need to do when our little boat seems to be stuck and making no progress, when it seems like we've been straining at the oar and we can't seem to get home, when it's like, don't I deserve better? Imagine if they would have said, you know what, I wanted just an easy plane trip sailing home. Imagine if they would have had an easy passage. What would they have missed out on? So we don't know what we'd miss out on if it went well. We just know that God works all things together for our good, as he did for them. With that, then, we'll close. Ask him, you need to come confess this Jesus who can walk upon the sea, who can show his glory as God did, who can reassure with the words, it's me, don't be afraid. If you need to come confess him and take shelter there, we ask you to come confess him. If you need to be baptized in his name and be added to him, we can do that. If you need to repent of sin and return, we can help you with that as well.